data security and, again, the near future. We can go as utopian or dystopian as possible, but I'd like to aim for some realism, some realistic fear, which is pretty dystopian. But hi, I'm Caroline. I'm one of the co-founders of Facets. I used to work at IBM Watson as a design researcher. I now work at the Wikimedia Foundation as an online harassment researcher, and we're looking at various ways to use design and machine learning to study and mitigate online harassment inside of all of the different language wikis. Chelsea, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chelsea Manning. I'm here. I think most people know who I am. I won't. I'm here. I worked with artificial intelligence in the past. I worked with primitive predictive analysis and statistics, for the Department of Defense. That's kind of like where I get my interests and my background is seeing how even primitives of the systems that we use today, and how they impacted large populations and how feedback loops have developed over time.
Beautiful. My name's Kate Crawford. It is an honor to be here, and I'd like to start out with a giant thank you to Chelsea for all of the things that you've done to let us have this conversation.
Thank you.
As an academic and a professor, you have given us the ability to have conversations that we couldn't have before, that are incredibly important about how we think about systems, technology, and operations of power. So I like to think that the conversation today is partly enabled by things that you have brought into the world. So my name is Kate Crawford. I am a distinguished research professor at NYU. I am also a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and I am now the co-founder and co-director of the AI Now Institute at NYU, which is a research institute dedicated just to understanding the social, political, and cultural implications of large-scale data, machine learning, and AI. That's me.
Thank you. Kate, you, as always, said it more eloquently than I did, but I wanted to also echo that it's a great privilege to be on this panel with you, Chelsea, and I don't use the term hero lightly, but you're a hero of mine, and thank you for everything. So I'm an artist. I started working with data in the way that I think a lot of us still work with data, which is kind of from a spaceship. Orbiting a distant planet that you can look on but not feel like you're part of, and maybe you would fire a tractor beam occasionally and do some samples from the surface. But I think for a lot of my practice, I didn't get onto the surface, and that was a real problem, and I think continues to be a real problem in the way that we interact with data systems in general, is that our technology has afforded us a great distance. Now I try to get on the ground as much as possible, and I hope we talk about that, because that's really what most of my work is about these days, is about how do we build data literacy at a community level, how do we foster engagement with data that brings these conversations out of rooms like this and into larger parts of the communities.
Yeah, I think data is such a big part of when you're working inside of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and I think that sort of feeds into this anecdote you had, Chelsea, when you spoke earlier, was it last month at Noisebridge?
Yeah.
About sort of what it was like with the primitive systems you were working in. I'd love it if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I have to totally agree. It is that's a great analogy. The spaceship analogy is initially, whenever I was working with these systems, I was working from, it was completely abstract, even though it was real data of a real combat zone, war environment, with huge, amounts of big. At the time it was big. It was big data. The term wasn't really used very frequently then, but basically it's now well understood to be big data. And initially I worked with these primitive systems, and it was just statistical analysis of large data sets and how can we predict things based upon patterns, and it all seems so abstract, and we never had because I was stateside, and I had never set foot in a combat zone before, but it was different whenever I was on the ground and I was there day after day, it was a completely different perspective on everything. It's like, oh my goodness, these aren't just statistics. I'm not, and everything's a lot more complicated in reality. The on the ground reality is way more complex. And I started to appreciate the value of life in my own life, and the data that I was working with was not just data. It was, humanity. It was everything, all the thoughts, all the memories, all the emotions of every single person, and it became overwhelming. So, so one of the anecdotes that I had that I brought up was the fact that there were these feedback loops where I was working with this large amount of data, and we were able to make predictions, and I was able to make very, very astute predictions based on statistical analysis. But I started to notice that there were these feedback loops. Like, oh my goodness, when we do something, it causes a reaction, and we can that reaction causes another reaction. So by kind of nudging and responding to one thing, we were creating a wave, a feedback loop of more violence, more really bad things happening. And so I kept on trying to bring it up, hey, when we do this, when we respond in this way, it brings up a feedback loop. But it was misinterpreted by the people, by the commanders and the people on the ground, and especially from the operational leadership. They were confused by it because I was telling them I predict based upon the mathematics, I can predict this, but they saw the predictions as whenever it would fit within what they wanted, they would see it a prediction as of something bad happening as being a justification for the current thing. It was just a complete. It was well, the computer says that this bad thing will happen if you do this, and it's so the computer's recommending that I do this, and I'm no, that's not. And so it was just it was very difficult to try to communicate between from a statistical analysis perspective to an on-the-ground operations perspective, and I could tell that there was probably some deliberate misunderstanding as well. So.
I mean, I think that instance really brings to mind the show Heather Dewey-Hagborg did, envisioning different kinds of computational models of your face, and none of them looked like you. And that's one thing I found working in machine learning as well, was trying to explain how these results weren't canonical results. We were asking questions when we didn't know what was inside of the data. That didn't mean it was representative of the data we were working with. And it was trying to teach one-on-one ethics to the sales team at IBM Watson, which was really difficult. Because how do you explain that there's it's not yes or no or 100% or 0% with machine learning. You're dealing with all these variabilities, that accuracy is like a shot in the dark that's constantly moving. Accuracy inside of machine learning is anything that's above 50%. Mm-hmm. And so you're actually dealing with inaccuracies, which I think is very like human behavior. You're dealing with all this gray zone, all this gray matter. Things are rarely binary.
Yeah. I'm loving that we're actually having this conversation by grounding it in the military use of these technologies, because this is the history of artificial intelligence. And if you go back to where it came from in sort of 1956 and the Dartmouth Conference, and then how it was operationalized and funded, I mean, it was through DARPA, it was through DoD. And now we're seeing these tools taken from sort of military engagements and various sort of wars and conflicts, and really put inside civilian zones and inside civilian life. And so we're used to these probabilities, it could be 80% right some of the time, and people say, well, in a war zone context, that's acceptable.
20%.
Okay,
good enough.
That's even more depressing.
Yeah.
And then suddenly start to think, well, what is that confidence level when you start applying that to, say, predictive policing? If you start applying that to, say, what's happening with the Department of Homeland Security, and how we're starting to look at sort of large-scale deportation based on predictions from Palantir's systems. I mean, these systems have now become part of a civilian life without, I think, a really important public conversation about the way that these tools come with a particular set of ideologies, with a particular set of confidence levels, and with a particular way of seeing the world. I mean, I just love the way that we're talking about the fact that these systems operationalize human life and represent human life in particular ways that should concern us. Even if it's as simple as saying that a system would predict that you are black or white or male or female. What sort of violence do we do just using these types of categories? I love that one of the things we've talked about today is the Kaczynski paper, which is the AI gaydar paper. I'm sure most people here have heard about this. And it's incredibly troubling to me that this paper could be critiqued from the level of science. I think there's a lot of real problems about the way it was done, but far more fundamentally, that we can actually claim that you could understand somebody's sexuality by their face, that these are things that are somehow biologically encoded in us, and that people aren't experiencing their own interiority, their own self-expression, their own self-determination.
Yeah, I spent 2.5 years at the New York Times, so a lot of my thinking around this does encapsulate a kind of journalistic viewpoint. And I think in that story, there's a huge amount of culpability on the case of the journalists who wrote the headlines in ways that totally didn't say what that paper is about, right? So like that paper, to drastically simplify, is like this machine learning has learned how to identify like queer signifiers on dating sites. Yeah. And that's not at all what the headline was written as. The headline was written as that it could like tell your sexuality or your sexual persuasion by your face. And that gulf in between the truth and what was headlined is extraordinarily dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it's wrapped up in questions about the economies of journalism and is it better to write a story that gets more clicks than one that discards a fundamentally, I don't even know, I can't even think of a bad enough word for that. You're reinforcing an idea that's an evil idea.
Yeah.
I feel like that example is also a great metaphor for machine learning, where it's like an algorithm will be designed to do something you're not quite sure where it was trained on or what it was designed to do, and then you can add data to it. And there's this gulf between like the intentionality and then the truthiness of how people interpret it. Mm-hmm. And it's like a truthiness. It's not true nor false. It's like this, again, sliding scale.
Absolutely. And again, I think one of the things we've had happen time and time again in the panels today is that we need to be really specific about which systems we're talking about and where. Totally. And systems will have very different ways of interpreting humans on the ground, sort of collective activity. And just as a society, we have to start getting really much more up to speed on what happens when you start letting these systems loose. Something like the AI gaydar system, that's a paper. Anyone can download it. You can use it to scrape another dating site. You can use it to start making assumptions about people. And we have is it like 78 countries where people will get jailed on the basis of their sexuality? this comes at a cost. We can't claim that these systems are not actually implicating human lives.
Not to escalate the conversation, but what do we do about that? How do we protest or intervene inside of these systems? That's one thing I think it's on everyone's mind.
Well, from my perspective, I think it's one thing to identify that there's a problem, and there's a paper I've cited a couple times which pointed out that 90% of people already believe that they don't have any control of their information. They don't know where it goes. They don't know how it's used. Like, we already have this sense. We already kind of understand. Like, the average person really does understand that now that that all this data, this trail that they're throwing out there is being used for other things, whether it's advertising or whatever. But everybody kind of has the sense of like, well, I'm too small. I can't really do anything about it. I can't. It's too big of a problem. Somebody else is going to fix it, right? And they're not. Nobody's going to fix it because like the people that we're asking to fix it are like the people that want to make us a crap ton of money, or even just kill us. Like just wipe us out. Wipe us out from the face of the earth. So we have to like recognize that we have to do something about it, and that we whether we're from a technologist perspective, we have to understand that we have an ethical obligation to we have an ethical obligation to assess what we're building, whatever our component is, how it can be misused, how it can be mishandled, what it does. And a lot of times I talk to programmers or developers, and they're more focused on like deadlines and like there's this number of hours that they've allotted for this amount of work, and like how many lines of code, and it's like it's very separated from like the consequences of writing code. And I think that every so often we need to have a temperature check, especially for those of us that actually are doing the coding to sit down, do a temperature check, assess like what are the implications of the software that I'm developing, even with our bosses over our shoulder, like demanding things. We have to like take the time, because like they're at the end of the day, meeting these demands is really, and forgetting that we have an obligation to take these temperature checks is really causing developers that know that their systems are dangerous and that they're bad to forget that for the sake of, well, I don't want to get fired.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that's also how do you create a framework. Even like one thing I think a lot about is if you're like a product designer at Facebook, for example, and you work on the Facebook timeline. So you can feel like you are a hyper-specific cog in a very specific kind of machine. But how do you provide frameworks to support those that are working inside of these bigger, large-scale networks that affect our everyday lives? What about the engineer at Google? Like, what are questions that we can create, or spaces of support, or even just a framework to think about that the work you're doing on a day-to-day basis, how does it affect others? And how do we as consumers like demand that kind of transparency, those kinds of ethical frameworks?
I mean, the question about what can be done, I'll tell you like the thing that like keeps me up at night is that I think I started really thinking about these things in 2009, so like almost 9 years ago. And I think about like how much better of a job could I have been done if I just stopped right then and said, let's start like teaching people about this. And like at a high school level, like could we have a bunch of kids who are now 22 who now understand this thing as adults? Because I think about the areas, like there's like the experts, and then there's like people who might attend a conference like this, and then there's like readers of the New York Times, but there's like this huge other part that we don't even try to do anything towards. And for me, that reflects my work in that sphere has usually been around civic data, because I think civic data is one of these places where we believe that civic data, it's open data, it's like been placed out there for the use of everybody, but it's actually in the same way, it's being used by a rarefied few. So can we put that civic data in, like to be an actual useful thing by people who live in communities? And that might be a good way to start. And it's such a huge problem that I've been trying to think about, like what are some small ways to start? And curriculum is something I think about a lot. I don't really know past that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think a lot about. I mean, basically, it's the reason I get out of bed every morning, is that my sense of urgency in this space is now absolutely at 100%. Yeah. That effectively now we need to start operationalizing what we can do. And I just love that Chelsea's like, if people think this is being done, it is not being done. Yeah. This idea that, somehow AI policy will figure itself out. I mean, we are currently with an administration, the Trump administration, which has basically just completely evacuated the field here. It's like, regulation, we don't need it. They're actually moving away from thinking about the sorts of things that certainly the AI Now Institute has been calling for. So one of the things that sort of, despite that dark kind of political structure in which we are currently placed, the thing that I'm really optimistic about is that there is a lot of work we can do. And I think absolutely pedagogy, curriculum is part of it. I also think we can really start to put pressure on, like as broader communities, these companies and governments using these systems, asking for forms of accountability. And this is much more than transparency. I think transparency is going to be a really tough fight here, but I think accountability is a fight we can actually start to have. Right now, this week, actually, in New York City, the council is having hearings about whether or not public agencies should be using black box algorithms in decisions about whether you get welfare or whether you should get bail. And this is something that, we just released 10 recommendations, and the first one, and I can't believe we're the first organization to do this, but it's to say we should be forbidding black box algorithms in public agencies, agencies that are contending with criminal justice, that are, this is outrageous. It really is. We've had this thing called due process for a very long time, and Chelsea knows how rough that can be, but the fact of the matter is, we have had some sort of a system where you can call the facts against you into account. You can actually ask to see the record. You can actually ask to have a review.
Well, if you have money.
If you have money. But even then, I mean, we've also had situations where people can ask for a public interest lawyer. These things don't exist under the account of these sorts of systems when applied to public agencies. So this is just one example. I could talk for ages about others, and I shan't, because we've got lots of stuff to talk about. But I just want to give you a sense of hope that actually we can do stuff, and I think we have to do it collectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone
together.
Not
Yeah.
just tech, not
Yeah.
just people in tech.
I think this model of a sanctuary city becomes interesting at that point, right? Where like a civic municipality essentially could declare that they are going to put a set of rules forward that's different than the.
Yeah. It's starting to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I wonder, like the conversation we're having here, in a way it feels so open, but it's also like we're in a space. Like this is live stream, but this is a closed space. How do you find the URL if someone tweeted it? Like how do we start to have these sort of more galvanizing conversations? How do people be more aware that there are like that there is a public meetup inside of their city right now to discuss these black box algorithms? And also, how do you explain black box algorithms to the majority of the public? An example I think a lot about is my mom was an accountant and really into math. And she is often what I call the translator for my aunt. They're both from Mississippi. And trying to even watch my mom explain like in very simplistic terms, like this is what an algorithm can do and this is how it affects your life. Like so many props to my mom for like already knowing what that is. But there is no good metaphor, because we're dealing with things that like don't have a grounding in the way we've already kind of existed. Like how do you give a metaphor towards black box algorithms and the outputs that they have? I think Chelsea, like you've told me before about trying to like work backwards even when you get an output of like how did I get this?
Yeah. I've worked with big data sets and I've come up with great predictions, very accurate predictions, and I have no idea how it came up with the solution. I use the math myself, and I have I would go they would ask I would be asked well how did you come up with this number, and I would have to make up a reason because otherwise they wouldn't listen to me if I just told them it's statistics. And I think that's the case especially with with big data and where there's just so much there's such an information asymmetry that's going on where you're feeding this huge amount of training data into a very finely tuned, very honed in algorithm to make future predictions, and so there's almost like an intelligence there that we don't understand, that we can create, but we're not fully trying to reverse engineer it. And there's papers on trying to reverse engineer. I mean, I like the awesome pictures that are made from the deep dream imagery where it's reverse engineering these image recognition algorithms, but really, I mean, I have no idea where some of this stuff comes from, and I'm throwing guesses out there. So it is a black box. It's a black box even to the developers.
A lot of my assumption, and this is something I was a student of Jer's, and so it's very wonderful to have him here, is thinking about data literacy. And this is something when I was working with creating demos at Watson, the first thing would be well, what kind of data set are we dealing with? What's the data of the data? I like to think of it as how do you be a data ethnographer? What are you looking at? How old's the data set? Who's in it? How many things are in it? How do you break apart all the characteristics of the data set? And that can often shine a light on okay, this is how I got this result. But even still, it's having to do all of that and then look at the outcome and then work backwards and say are these the logical connections of what's happening? But then there are plenty of times where you can't or you're not allowed to dig into the data. The data is too big. That's way less of a question, I guess. More, yeah. But then I also wonder maybe if this prop that I have up here that my very dear friend David Lublin gave me for my birthday, if this should be required reading, computer power and human reason from judgment to calculation. How do you build in a kind of data literacy or kind of data awareness? How do you sort of bring in a demand or protest for tell me what's in the data, but then also how do you opt out of being in this data set?
Yeah. I mean, there's literacy on a number of levels here. We have to talk about like numeracy, straight up numeracy, and then there's computational literacy, but there's also the political literacy of it, which I think is really important. Like Chelsea, I was really taken by your op-ed which I think was titled with this phrase that you used about this dystopia that you signed up for.
Yep.
Right? And we talk a lot about this stuff as being new, but that is not new at all. Like we can track that back to 1988 with the creation of customer loyalty programs.
Yes.
Where people were essentially signed up for air miles numbers that could track them everywhere they went, and that was such a boon to marketers because they were like, "This is great! Like the customers are doing the work for us."
Yeah.
But the phrase there is quite interesting: customer loyalty program, right? It's a customer tracking program,
Yes.
but it was branded as a loyalty program, and so at the same time we have to do all this, we have to teach people how to get past. We heard some of it today. This kind of branding by corporations about their work and what it's doing when in fact what it's actually doing is something completely different.
Yeah.
And so I want to just send a shout out. The best moment of, well, not be the best, but one of the best moments of the year for me was in New Orleans. I organized a conference and we had this collective come from Detroit called Complex Movements, and they do this incredible, immersive, community-based performance about explaining complex subjects to people. And if you watch one thing this year, go and watch that video they spoke at the I/O conference this year. You can watch it online. That's the answer to me, like that type of like just really anchored in it's just so culturally effective to talk about this stuff and to do it at a community level and like just get out there and do it is part of that thing that they do so well.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you talk about the customer loyalty programs and I go to the pharmacy or the store, and one of the things that I go to whenever I go over to the register is they're like they're like, do you have a membership card? Do you have to, can you give me your phone number? And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that we can combat this is just by saying no. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
A lot of the check boxes on those forms, like if you really look carefully, there's a check box that says opt out. Opting out and take a step back is one simple and easy way in which we can do that. And it's a pain in the ass because it's like you're losing the $5 off or whatever. But if I think about it, I value my privacy more, so therefore I'm going to pay more for it. So
It's like we gave up safety for ease.
yeah.
Yeah, I wonder though if we're moving into a period now where there just is no opt-out. That effectively when machine learning is being built into our cities, when it's in our streetlights, when it's in every single facial recognition system, when you walk into a shop or when you clear customs, that realistically, like, these are not systems that allow for opt-out. And what
true.
worries me is that as somebody who is always like not given my zip code when I go to a store, it's like, it doesn't matter. They are tracking my face. They're building a 300,000 point model every time I walk into a store that can be recognized against multiple other systems and queried and then compiled into new platforms. And I guess for me, how do you deal with that, Chelsea? I mean, how do you think about the fact that we had these privacy capacities, this idea of saying no, of refusal? Where is refusal now? Where does that sit?
I mean, I would say like mask up or whatever. It's a little impractical in some jurisdictions.
It's tricky.
But like
ski masks are frowned on in some forms of public transport. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
But there's also even that paper that was coming out where there's the potentiality to recognize protesters' faces, and even at a certain point, if we all have CB Dazzle, algorithms will be able to sort of move beyond that and then recognize other things within that, or like learn and be adapted to work outside of that.
Well, as Adam Harvey has shown, who created CV Dazzle, which if you've seen it is the sort of makeup that can be used to try and essentially confuse facial recognition systems, they've well and truly already moved beyond that. And that realistically we're at a point now, if we try to win this in an arms race model where it's individuals going up against large scale systems, we're going to lose every time. For me, this is a collective action problem. This is only going to be solved politically. It's only going to be solved by large groups of people actually saying, no, we're actually not going to allow this system to be applied in this way. If we allow this mission creep of these systems to just start to touch everything from like education to access to credit to access to any type of job or job opportunity, as we know, right now, HR is where a lot of these systems are being tested out in the workplace because Americans have so little by way of privacy rights as workers that we're seeing like extraordinary systems being applied every time you even try to get a job or when you're in a job that can cause enormous harms down the track. So for me, like that's not a thing that you can necessarily solve as an individual.
I disagree. I disagree strongly. I
Okay,
think
good. Let's do it.
I think what gets forgotten sometimes is especially whenever institutions create these processes and they make the processes impossible, is that where else do you go? And at the end of the day, we have to fight back, and we don't have to fight back. We don't always have to fight back, but within the rules or whatever. And I think that people, and it is coming to a point, especially when we see the symptoms of these systems being executed in this place, and especially whenever it comes to like predictive policing or having advertising data, like create these feedback loops and among communities, and essentially like an algorithmically driven like class like separation seems to be going on. Like we don't have to stand up and we don't have to stand around and take that. We can talk to each other. We can figure out ways to fight back, and we don't have to just sometimes protesting and being out in the streets and not moving, and whenever they tell you to stop, hey, look, like we're fine. Like no, we're not fine. We're not going to move. Like I think it's as simple as that. I mean it's as simple as like nobody's going to do it for us. We're going to have to do it ourselves, and we have to work together to do that. And I don't think we're going to be. I don't think it's some simple law or some simple policy change that's going to happen, because we're just so far down where it is crisis mode. We're in crisis mode now.
No, I think we're completely agreeing. I think that's dead on. And for me, this is what I mean about collective action. It's not that we don't act because we have to wait till everybody agrees we're all on the same page. It's that we actually have to start thinking very concretely about where are spaces of resistance here. What are the things that we do?
Oh, you mean like the individual action as in like I'm gonna throw this one thing away in the recycling bin. That's gonna help climate change.
Yeah. Or I'm going to opt out of this one system, and that will save me. But it's
I agree
interesting. But I love the way that you've brought up this tension, right? Because I think you act as a type of historical example of what individuals can do in like systems that feel pretty damn like impossible to engage with. So, I mean, it's interesting that, my sense is that we need to think about political action and what it looks like, but maybe in a system where every time you go and protest on the street, you are again possibly endangering your ability to get a green card or to get a job, that protest, as we even previously understood it, has been so marginalized and so contained and is itself so
because they don't like it.
Exactly. Because it's
direct
threatening.
action works, and like that's why they shut. That's why police. I mean, I've been on the other side of it, where whenever they get up into a mass group, we don't like that. We don't like whenever people like protest and like show up and things like that. We discourage that because people in government, they get nervous when that happens. They're like, what's going on? We don't know what to do now. And like that's the kind of position you have to place them in, because it's the most powerful tool and weapon we have in fighting our institutions and against this like dystopian like reality. It's not a joke. Like this isn't as I've been saying, like people have been asking me like what do you think has changed since you've been since you've gotten out? And every single time I'm like, it's like I've walked out into a dystopian novel, but it's like the most boring dystopian novel because
it was written by white men, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a boring dystopian novel written by white men. But I kind of wonder if it's time for an Occupy algorithms then, and what does that start to look like?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this goes back to like thinking about community organizing and thinking about like the labor movement as a good reference, because I think this is a slightly different than like what most of us, and maybe I'm saying generalizing me, would be out in the street and protesting against. It's like something that is apart from me. This is like you're protesting something that's in your job and in your like. And there's a tremendous amount of risk that goes into that.
You almost
and so the
can't
labor
see these
movement was
things,
all
too.
about that. It was like, how can you protest the conditions within a system that you depend on for your livelihood?
Right.
And the answer to that was essentially everybody walk off the job. I have like French friends who keep on asking me with this whole Trump thing, like, when is the general strike? Like, what's happening? Like, why are we not?
It's because like the word union is like a terrible word.
Right.
You can't even say it. And I've floated the idea that like maybe people in technology because from the labor movement, like you you had this notion of like, oh, it's workers' conditions. It's you know, like but we're in a different world where like I mean, not for everybody, but for people in technology, like our worker conditions are pretty cozy because like they give us these nice chairs and like they've got like skateboards and things like that. Like it's not about the conditions, but it's about the moral and ethical implications of the systems we're doing. And we can like if we bound together and we say no, we're not going to do this, and we unionize or strike or whatever, like that is a tool that we have, but it's also a tool that like we haven't ever talked about because it's a big scary word. It's you know, and it has and it's kind of viewed as you know, because I think that striking and unions and all these things are very labor conditions oriented from a historical perspective. But like the same tools could be used in other situations, I think.
Yeah, I guess I wonder what a digital protest looks like. Like how do you when you're going through HR, for example, like so many entry points to jobs require you to go through LinkedIn or to use your Facebook to auto log in or automatically pull in a resume, and then they're looking for specific keywords to try to hire you. And then if they're trying to see if you're a match, and they're using any kind of algorithmic data, the data they're using is probably, if you're in technology, skewed towards qualities that benefit white men, because that's the majority of the workforce, right? So that means they're also looking at like, what school did you go to? And there's been a lot of really great studies done on if you went to a historically black university or college, that like you aren't considered for a tech job. If you've gone to General Assembly, like you're not hireable compared to someone that's gone to Cornell. And it's this thing of like, how do you, when you're applying something that seems innocuous as, oh, there was a job posting on LinkedIn, here's my information, how do you move beyond that, right? Like, how do you know what's trained on?
I mean, it's even worse than that now. I'm sure some of you guys read about this new system that's called HireVue that's being used by a whole lot of Fortune 500 companies, including Goldman Sachs, where if you go in and you have your job interview, they're basically recording you, they're filming you, and then they match your facial features, everything from your distance from your nose bridge to your eyes, through to the gestures that you use, through to the words that you select, and then comparing that to their most successful employees.
So
think about that. I mean, that is a system for entrenching bias. That is a system for, and if you think of like, say, a toxic workplace, like say Uber, for example,
right.
we know you have like a hyper-masculinist, like, you know, deeply problematic culture that has had a lot of complaints made against it. If you are matching to your most successful employee, you're actually entrenching a culture that will try to reject diversity and difference.
And you're also, sorry.
It's a definition of success, really.
Totally. Well, it's also something where, like, I was at a hackathon, and like that came up. It was at IDEO, and that came up as like a good suggestion for a potential startup. And I asked the team, I was like, well, how do you account for resting bitch face, like, or sarcasm? Like, who determines what these successful things are? What if you don't have a law of inflection? What if you culturally are taught to smile at certain times? A good example, I think, is faceception, where it's trying to rate the emotions in faces. And to sort of relate that to emotions. Well, if you're a woman and you're catcalled, for example, sometimes remaining calm and smiling is the safest thing you can do. That doesn't mean that you're actually feeling what you're expressing, right? So how do you account for the fact that like emotions are not perfect, that we are not supposed to be ourselves every moment of the day? When we're existing inside these systems, we're creating safe data that's flawed data because it's not true data, but it's a different kind of data.
Well, let's take it back to the military context again. I mean, faceception is designed to predict who is a terrorist.
Right.
And if you have a look at their website, it's the guy who looks strangely like Middle Eastern who's the terrorist, and it's the woman with the cool haircut who's the brand manager.
Right.
Like, I mean, these are some basic assumptions. Like, this is some really basic stuff that is just being propagated as though it's truth. And that's the thing that concerns me.
Right. When you said basic, I was like, oh, so it's like the pumpkin spice latte of
It is basic.
data sets of algorithms.
I mean,
Sorry.
basic. Yeah.
I've had a lot of coffee today. I guess, should we open up to questions from the audience? Yeah. I'll share with Chelsea. Or shall we? Let's go right over there. Thank you. Thanks, friend.
I would like to talk a little bit about privacy. When I came from the Soviet Union more than 20 years ago, I was amazed how about privacy in this country. In Soviet Union, it was impossible, but here, every landlord know about me much more than KGB in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
This started much longer. And now we have deal with consequences. They just got new tools. They did not change their psychology in what they are doing. If in the Soviet Union, I would be in big trouble if I'm against government. But here I will be in the big trouble if I'm against government. But I will be in maybe even bigger trouble if I don't pay credit cards on time or don't pay for the apartment in time. Not don't pay, but just in time. So it's just what we're talking about, it's just consequences. It's not the root of the problem, and we are afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that one of the things that astounds me about where we've gotten with our technology is that it's already being implemented enterprise-wide across all these different fields, whether government, corporate, private sector, or university, and it's already being implemented, and it's already having like symptoms. And we're always like, when we see like on TV, like there's like all these things happening all the time. They're symptoms of the algorithmic problems. So like we're always dealing with the symptoms of the problem and not the actual problem itself, which is the assumptions that are made in algorithms, the systems that are produced, the systems that we're building, the intent of the systems, and the fact that they're being implemented, and that we're collecting a huge amount of data, and that we're not doing anything about it because we keep fighting these symptoms. That's one of the things that we can do is like we can I guess technologists is we can like reach out and work with other activist groups that are dealing with the symptoms to be like, hey, look, we know what the cause of all this is. Let's work together here. We have to show some solidarity with each other, and because it really is a much deeper and bigger rooted problem than just than just like one group here, one group there. Like we're dealing with symptoms of these problems all the time, and that's a perfect example of the fact that we do have symptoms everywhere, and that whether it's getting a credit card or like going to prison or whatever, like there's all these different aspects of our lives that are being controlled by the same algorithms.
Yeah, I think you put it really succinctly. There's this amazing paradigm of capitalism in that it's like unstoppable but also extraordinarily fragile. And any suggestion you say in this country to protect workers' rights in the case of data, they're like, whoa, you're going to like get in the way of the profit, and it's going to damage the way that this is going. And I think this comes to something that Chelsea said, is that these are human beings, some of us in the room who work for these companies that are doing these things, and maybe what it's going to take is some people to walk out of the job.
I mean, that's something that, like, after the election, there were these, at least this is something I had read about, all these, like, private meetups inside of Facebook and Twitter and Google to really talk about, like, what did we do? And I wonder if it's also something, how do we also create support for those employees or create spaces for them to, like, share these stories? Is it like better knowledge with like how to use secure drop and like here are the different journalists that you should reach out to? Is it how do we make sure that like someone like Reality Winner, for example, isn't tracked from the data that she leaked, right? It was because she printed out a piece of paper and folded it, and like that paper folding was printed and they were able to track it. Like it's an incredible pipeline of how do you provide support for those that, one, first can help them recognize the data that they have, two, protect them when they release that data, and three, also like be able to I guess do this kind of due diligence of publishing the data well. And I mean, it's hard to do that in an era of fake news.
We have more questions at the back, I think.
Lots of questions.
Hey, so I'm thinking two things. One is that most people in this room are kind of literate when it comes to data and what's possible with data. And I think the big problem, if you want to start a protest or a revolution or anything alike, is that the majority has to be aware of what's going on with data. I think the other thing is this confusion that the only people who, or like the only institutions that can have our data and do meaningful things with our data are companies like Google and Facebook. Are huge companies. And that's not true. Like the data is ours, we give it to them, and strangely nothing has popped up to tell people like, look, you still own the data, we show you all the benefits of what we can do with your data, and you get those benefits, and then maybe some system to scale that, like whether people pay for that, but the data remains private and they still own it, or some other way to like make that a thing. But the point is people have that data. I think the other thing that plays into that confusion is kind of this idea of merchants of doubt, where the cigarette companies, all they had to do to sort of keep people smoking is to release studies that would say, no, smoking doesn't actually higher the risk of cancer. Like we don't really need to, like people don't really need to know like smoking is good or smoking is bad. They just don't, it's enough for them not to know exactly whether it's good or bad. And I think it's the same thing with our information, where companies like Facebook, we sort of go there and we get a benefit, right? We can talk to our friends, we can get like events and all that, and the infrastructure is amazing and it's fast and so forth. But then there's this sort of weird thing where we know it's bad, and we know that we somewhat feel anxious after using it sometimes. And I think if we could work on something like that, that shows us like, you just use Facebook, like how do you feel? Right? Do you feel anxious now? And sort of to like collect data about how people feel about these big companies. That's it.
Do you ask some more questions? Yeah.
Hi. So I absolutely loved this panel. I'm on the science side of things, and a lot of people from science are constantly moving to the sort of various companies, and we see the kind of transformation that they go through after that. Currently, and given sort of this kind of a provocation that Caroline inspired by using the term Occupy algorithms, I don't know of any single organization that is something like, computational justice or algorithmic transparency, that anyone from any of these fields, whether they're a researcher, whether they're at Google, or whether they're somewhere else, could actually, you guys have that? So.
Oh, well, I just made one.
Yeah.
This is why we created AI Now, was for precisely this reason. The reason that it came about was because for 2 years we ran a conference, both with experts and then for the public, because we believe that everyone needs to be part of this conversation, and then listened to what people's concerns were. And it was incredibly clear to us that there really isn't enough work being done, both to try and understand how these systems are affecting people, but then to show people publicly how these systems are working and to give them a stake in it.
Are you planning on making a kind of AI workers union or such? Because that would make a big difference if that happens. And if it's not just about scientists or Facebook people, it's anyone who's actually involved in AI.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and frankly, I think that there's actually a lot of things that have to happen simultaneously. Our organization is specifically looking at social implications and trying to come up with ways of understanding that and showing what is at stake, because that is such a huge thing. But I also think there are a lot of really great workers' rights organizations already there, and part of what we need to do is actually empower people who are already activists working on these issues and giving them the knowledge to understand how these systems work.
Link them.
Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to pull it at a detail that got mentioned earlier, which was the sort of different types of black boxing that goes on with big data and machine learning. Chelsea, I believe you mentioned, even though you were the one who wrote these things and knew the source data, not knowing why it found the answer it did.
Yeah.
And I am completely on board with all of these sort of longer-term solutions we're talking about for data transparency and algorithmic transparency. But I'm curious, in terms of the reducible kinds of black boxing, keeping a log of what data was used for training so that people can look back and see what possible biases may come out of that. What things could you recommend to someone, maybe unintentionally building, the 21st century version of 19th century biological criminology today, right now? What what could you recommend they do, or what steps could they take today?
I don't know that you can do anything about it. And, you know, like as a perfect example, I went to Trevor Paglin's exhibit a few months ago. Might have been a few weeks ago, actually. I can't keep track. But I went to his exhibit at the opening, and I was struck by the fact that he had all this face training data from like and you could tell by the hairstyles and like the clothes that they were wearing that it was like the mid 90s. You know, it was like 1996 or whatever, and it was like VHS tapes. And this was data that was being fed for these for facial recognition systems. And so like, there was just hours and hours and hours of different people doing different emotions. And like, no, I don't know if they even knew what they were doing at that moment, or what the just we're collecting all this data, but we don't know what the implications of that data are 20 years from now. But I mean, I think what's really important right now is that we know the implications of the data that we're putting in now, and it's already bad. So we need to like figure something out fast, you know, and this is, I mean, like I've heard the phrase a lot, you know, especially among protest groups, like, you know, like whose streets, our streets, like maybe we should start thinking about like whose data, our data,
Yeah.
you know, like.
I love that. One of the things in Trevor's show is that ferret training that is, which is one of the first ever facial recognition training sets that was made in Maryland by DoD. And the hairstyles are incredible. Like you have the perms and the flicks, and you have like this kind of like moment in time. And what's so interesting about that is it reminds us that these training data sets come from a moment in time. And this is why the bias debate is so alive right now, is this realization that in actual fact, if we don't do a lot of work, large-scale training data sets will actually reflect our worst historical biases. They are built in. They come pre-supplied. And the amount of work that has to be done, I think, is far more than just technical. It's socio-technical. We have to think about the fact that structural bias exists, that this isn't a thing that we can just tweak out of a data set. And that's a realization that's going to take a long time to get, because the technical community still doesn't see this as a deeper issue. They see it as something that we can neutralize in the data. I think it's much bigger than that.
I mean, I think a lot of that's also when you're creating these systems. I mean, I think about this from the product design standpoint. What do you actually need for your product for it to work? What do you need from like the data you're collecting on people? Do you need to know their birth date or their gender? Do you need to know their exact location at all times? And I think this also comes up in a conversation we were having earlier, like the Enron email data set's public, for example, but that has, you know, real people's names in it. Does it have people's phone numbers? Were those things scrubbed? It wouldn't be hard to like legally put that it wouldn't be hard for this data set to be made anonymized, right? And I think about this a lot because I work for a radically transparent open source nonprofit. I have to put my research out there. And we've decided to be transparently opaque about the online harassment research we use.
Transparently opaque. Do you want to describe that?
Yes. You will never read an exact person's report of their online harassment. We will not tell you the people we interviewed or where they came from. We won't tell you how many people we interviewed. We will tell you that we're doing a mix of surveys and personal interviews. You will never see the entire data set. You will never see people's emails from that. We can tell you different things we learned from the outcome, but you will not see the exact research. So it's making sure that if you filed a report, no one can pinpoint that report to you, but we can talk at a high level of, this year we had this many incidents of online stalking, and we talked to over 1,000 people across these countries, but we won't say how we talked to them. So you can't go and try to find this. So that's what I think about this a lot. How do you be transparently opaque about sensitive data, for example?
And it's incredibly important because one of the kind of more naive responses to the sorts of power concentration in the AI industry that we've been talking about, and the tech industry more broadly, is, oh, we just need open data sets. Just release the data. It's our data. We own it. It's like, well, actually, we're going up against one of the most extraordinarily power concentrated industries in the world. And this idea that somehow just having open data would somehow like corrode that, when in actual fact that data itself can represent a type of time bomb that can come back when you have, say, a credit system that looks at everything that you did online to decide whether or not you can get like a loan for, you know, your kid's education. So I love the fact that you're actually thinking about this, Carolyn, because I think it's actually really hard, and I don't think it's a solved problem, but I think the more that we start to come up with these more nuanced responses, the more hope we have.
Yeah. I mean, I think that artists and researchers, we share this problem of we like to avoid the hard question too, which is this question around consent and how to do informed consent around these types of systems. And we use the same shield that like, not to make it too simplistic, that the other side uses, which is it's okay because we're doing good work, right? Like, and
We're the good guys.
and
We're always
that-
doing good work.
like we got to look it in the eye, and you have to say like regardless of how good I think my research outcome is it okay to use this data? And if it's not, then don't use it.
Yeah, exactly right.
And I think as, like, to be a little bit more specific about even some of the work that I'm doing, what I've told people is, like, you don't actually have to read the reports I've read, but I can explain my methodology and my reasoning behind how we're determining, for example, what is conflict versus harassment versus abuse. How are we writing our policy from reading real people's stories or interviewing victims? You don't have to read someone's personal story to determine if it's harassment. I'm a researcher and I can provide parameters and a taxonomy for you. And I can also tell you the exact methodology we're using to determine things, but also then we can take what we're reading and provide anonymized examples of, in this case, this version of online stalking is considered more conflict because someone followed you around 5 times on the English language encyclopedia and reverted 4 edits. If someone does that 200 times over the course of 2 months, that's a whole different kind of model that is persistent online stalking. We call this wiki hounding, but it goes into a much different kind of abusive territory. But you don't have to read someone's exact report to determine that. I can tell you, as I've just done, for example, that these are the parameters of what we're working within.
Do we have some more questions at the back? I just want to give people a
Hi.
chance.
When reputations and a lot of money are on the line, researchers will sometimes tend to cheat. This happens in medical science, and a way to prevent that is registering a trial before it's conducted, so you make sure that people don't move the goalposts. We have examples of high-stakes things, say in the military with the Millennium Exercise, where simulation didn't produce the results that the funders wanted, and so they changed the parameters until they won. And I was curious if there are anything that's looking upstream of where AI is being created, where algorithms are being created, to try and create accountability before the work is actually done.
Yes, I love this question. Can I just say that one of the big things that we've been pushing for at the A&L Institute, and one of the big recommendations that we made last week was pushing for not just pre-release trials on all high-stakes AI and ML systems, but that these pre-release trials, which in many cases are happening, depending on the company and the system, are made public. And obviously, that's not going to solve some of the bigger sort of existential questions that we've been talking about today, but it's going to give us more insight into how a system was tested. Has it only been tested on white men in urban centers? Is it going to have different impacts on different types of populations? What was the age group that was tested on here? I mean, just these really basic ideas around where did this system get designed and for whom, and giving us some insight into that, I think would be a really big step. The next step you could ask, which is even more radical, is to say you're accountable once it goes into the wild. You actually have to start reporting on, well, what were those effects and who did actually have these negative impacts because of your system? Because right now we don't even have that. I mean, this is the thing that, again, to get back to this idea that this is, someone's handling this problem. This is not a handled problem. So, and that is something that we can actually all start to call for, is to say, well, show us some pre-release trial data, show us that this system is actually safe and ethical, because I think we actually have the right to ask that question.
Yeah, and walk the walk. Like, we need more projects that show how this can be done right.
Yeah.
They don't exist, really.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in our particularly problematic field.
Yeah, I can only think of bad example, just constantly, just this is not good, this is not good, this is not good. So I think that's a very good point. I think it's important. I've seen it myself. Where I've seen analysts that are more politically oriented towards, being seen by officers as being good and punctual and on time and caring more about appearances, tweak the statistical data so that would have the result that the officers wanted, and it would help their careers, but it would essentially lead to bad decisions. So,
and that's somebody's life on the line.
Yeah,
right?
it's lots of people's lives.
Yeah.
Hi, so I work in security, and one of the things that is often on my mind is like the most private data is data that you don't collect at all. Like if you collect some data, there is a risk that it leaks. And so things that I think about are, for example, like there are all these DNA registries where you can go and get your DNA tested, but like that's kind of really frightening data to be collected, and what happens if it gets leaked. We've also been talking a lot about, for instance, credit data. And like Equifax just had a giant breach. And
Data likes to leak.
Yes, it does.
Data is leaky.
And one of the things that really concerns me about this is, for example, in the Equifax case, I have a friend who was affected by that. Like, somebody tried to withdraw $200,000 in their name, and like, there's these large corporations or institutions that are benefiting off of the collection of this data, but then when things go wrong, individuals are held to account to deal with the consequences. And so I guess my question for you is, how do we incentivize or legislate or however we create policies in order to prevent data from being collected, and then for the data that is collected, when that does leak, how do we help?
You can't depend on that, and the reason why is because this actually happened already. Laws have been written. Legislation has been passed and written very quietly, of course, in which in an instance, because the big companies they allow the government to look at their data whenever at any time that they ask for it. They are not legally liable. They are not liable for damages. They're not liable for a suit. They're not liable for a class action suit. And we've seen more and more, the process is actually protecting the big institutions and not us, and vote better legislators. I mean, it's just, the reality is that I think that, it's a self-propelling system that, I don't think we're going to be able to deal with this through legislative manner.
So how do we stop it?
Excellent question.
We have another question.
I mean, I think that there are some like legislative methods that are coming out, and I think a lot of it is, especially in this time under Trump, like know who your representatives are and call them. There's also, at least from the online harassment perspective, there's been a lot of bills that have been that are coming up to be voted on that like diminish net neutrality, for example, but under the guise of protecting individuals. Some of them call for like giving better digital training to police officers so they can understand Twitter better, so they can understand when people are being online harassed, like what that means. From one perspective, one angle, as someone who studies online harassment, it's very taxing as a victim to have to explain to someone what Twitter is and why you can't just turn it off. But it's not thinking about the bigger system that it's in. And I think part of the problem, what we're seeing is like sweeping legislation, where it's trying to solve a problem like something like online harassment, but it's not thinking of all the implications. Or there are other things that are like stuck underneath this bill to solve other problems, right? And I think a lot of this is like it's intentionality, it's being really specific. It's maybe, I think I always hesitate to say like legislation because I work for Wikimedia and you shouldn't, but open source, but there are these specific lines, and I don't have a good framework for what we should do, but it's just being aware that there's like there's a necessary awareness that we need now that we've never had before. And I don't know what to say beyond that other than like we all have to be hyper aware and know exactly who represents you.
I think there's two prerequisites that have to be met. One is you have to take money out of politics, and two, you have to prevent politicians from becoming rich lobbyists later.
So I just went to this panel that the NSF and the NEH funded called Algorithms Are Us, sort of talking about how humanists can help scientists and vice versa. And there was a person who is a humanities person who worked for the government as a humanities person who got paid to go to this event that was called Algorithms Are Us, who on the second day said, I don't really know what an algorithm is, right? So here's someone with a doctorate who works for the government who has come to a conference about algorithms and cannot be bothered to learn about it and is very dismissive. So how do we reach an average person who does not have a doctorate, who does not work for the government? Like, it has been bothering me for a month, as you can see.
Average people are aware, but they're aware through the consequences, I think, and that's I think the key is we're not going to be able to explain to them how algorithms work. We're not going to be able to explain, but we can talk to them and we tell them, like, we know the reasons why this is happening, and I think that's an effective like segue into that conversation.
Plus one to that. I mean, if you say this is a system that will decide whether or not you can get housing, whether you can get welfare, whether you will get benefits of any kind, whether you will get a job, whether you will get out of jail. I mean, these are enormously consequential systems that are now influencing so many of our core social institutions. I think people really do get that. I think the problem is the story is being told as a sort of a technocratic story, is that we have to understand algorithms. We actually don't have to understand algorithms at all. We have to understand how to protect core social institutions for the good of all. And that's the thing that is the most important here, and we can do that. But we have to sort of take the debate away from being overly fixated and I think perhaps mystified by the kind of glowing technical terminology and exciting whiz-bangery that you might see a lot of in the technical press. Like, this is actually about something very fundamental, about basic human rights and how we're going to experience social institutions.
Yeah, I actually have one idea, and that is that I think, maybe we just need to consider the possibility that maybe we as technologists and we and that work in engineering and science and the implications of these things, maybe we don't have the answers, but maybe the general public does have the answers that we don't have, and maybe they have some, maybe they know something we don't, and I think that's a real possibility.
So I have a question, just as we're talking a bit about legislation. I was in Europe last week, and a bunch of people at a conference I was at were really kind of hopeful about this GDPR law that's going into effect soon. I was wondering if you guys could talk a bit about that and if you think it might have some positive effects for us here.
Sure, yeah. Look, general data protection guidelines come online in May. I actually think they're really interesting, and the fact that the center of gravity in terms of legislative power has shifted away from the US and towards Europe is a really significant moment. The thing that a lot of people are excited about in GDPR is this idea of a right to explanation. So that if a system makes a decision about you, say whether or not you're going to get into university or whether or not you're going to get out of jail, you have a right to know how that decision was made. That's a pretty profound claim, and that would help with a lot of these systems. Now, how that might be implemented or watered down, I think, is really critical here, and certainly it's something that, just know that all of the technology companies right now are paying a lot of attention, and they're spending a lot of engineering resources trying to think about how you shard servers and how you deal with the new sort of pressures that you're going to have with these systems. But we really have to talk about some realpolitik that GDPR is going to have its strongest influence in Europe, and in the US right now, we're dealing with an administration that is going to push back on anything that looks like it's a control on the private sector.
Yeah.
And this exists already. Unfortunately, what it means is that Facebook's not going to get better. It's just we're going to see two Facebooks, and one of them is going to play by those rules, and the other one's going to not.
Yeah.
And that comes back to like the bravery to make a decision that's the ethically right one, which I don't know.
But what's exciting, and just to sort of give us a little bit of optimism, is the fact that if people start to realize that maybe explanations are something that they are owed, that they can be given an explanation, and then that might be a right, is a thing that moves like a meme, right? People will start to think about it, and they're like, well, why is it that I can get that if I'm in Berlin, but I can't get it if I'm in New York? That idea is powerful, and it's kind of catchy. So I think people can still be legitimately excited about the fact that we're starting to come up with more powerful frameworks.
My concern primarily with the new European regulations is that laws can be changed, laws can be repealed, laws can be watered down, and data is still collected. And even though we have big changes today, if it's collected, you never know, because these people love to lobby, laws out of existence over time, and we've had regulations here in the past, and now there's been like more deregulation, and Europe has had a history of having phases of deregulation as well.
So, we have time for 2 more questions.
This guy in the front's been waiting forever.
Hi.
Here.
Hello. Since we're talking so much about voting, I just wanted to take a moment to mention for all New York City residents that November 7th is going to be a local election, so please make sure that you actually go participate.
Thank you.
Yay.
Woo. Big ups.
Do you want to stand up, sir?
Yeah, sure.
This guy.
So I mean, I've enjoyed the talk. Yeah, thank you so much for this very enlightening talk. Though I guess what I've noticed is that typically it's been talked through a very Western perspective, and that's really influenced by like a lot of techno-skepticism, right? And so I'm really interested to hear about like what you think like other sort of cultures are relating to in terms of AI and this sort of data security, like any sort of research that you've done or any experience you've had with that in the past and how it's influencing your work now.
Yeah.
Yeah, whoever wants to go. This is for all of the panel.
Yeah. So I pay a lot of attention to that to that because I go through the lens. You know, I grew up in the United States. Yeah, I went to school here. You know, I've spent you know, even though I've been exposed to other cultures, certainly I'm ingrained with a very individualistic mindset as opposed to, you know, like a communitarian mindset. So I often have to remember that I have these blinders on me, and so I look at data, but I look at these problems through the lens of different cultures often. Very specifically, and I'm always a bit surprised at how little discussion there is, or how little things have been translated, or that, you know, like, because, you know, I've read things from, you know, from Japan or from China, but not necessarily India or Africa, you know, so that there, you know, it's been harder for me to see different discussions on privacy issues in different cultures because it either doesn't get translated or it's not discussed, you know, in the same kind of context, or maybe I'm just not finding it and I'm just not digging deep enough. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I love this question. I guess there's a personal response and there's a geopolitical response. The geopolitical response is that if we're talking specifically about what's happening with AI and machine learning, at the moment we're really looking at a two-horse race between the US and China, with possibly Russia, if we start to include state actors, coming in third there. And that is really concerning to me, that we're looking at, again, not just a concentration of power in terms of the companies involved, but in terms of the countries that have the ability to really deploy this at scale, thus turning the rest of the world into client states. That is a big problem. From a personal level, though, this kind of US hegemonic understanding of systems has been going for a while. Like, we can go back to the 60s and look at the fact that, like, English is just being understood as a dominant language of computation, that if you go to Nigeria, there are, like, you know, 78 different languages, none of whom are actually able to be translated within each other within any kind of, you know, technical platform system. So that sense of the fact that these systems are created for a particular type of Western dominance is real. But once you pour, like, you know, oil on the fire and you start creating autonomous and semi-autonomous systems, that's when I think we have to look very closely at who has their hands on the reins of power here and what that will mean for who these systems serve.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer to your question other than to like for all of us to keep asking it. And you know, my spaceship analogy actually came from this thing that I kind of a little bit obsessed with, which is this data exploration interface from MIT in 1971 called Data Land, and it looks exactly like a spaceship. And you look at like who those men were and what they were reading and what was influencing it, is like these are like white men reading sci-fi by white men about what the future of the world is going to look like. And so, like, I don't know, like the smallest thing I can do is to like read some sci-fi not by white men. And like I've been reading some really good
Octavia Butler.
Yeah, or like, you know, Nnedi Okorafor, who's Nigerian American and is writing some really great sci-fi right now, N.K. Jemisin, who's from Brooklyn. Like, that's really helped me. And it's a small thing, but like a lot of my ideas do come from fiction, and mental constructs that I build come from the things I learned as a kid, from the books I read. And so can we read different ones that are entrenched in other cultures, and maybe that comes so that our futures are different. But that's what we want, right? Different future.
I think for me, this is sort of less on AI, but it's often thinking about when you're protecting one group, are you causing harm to another? So a big thing in online harassment is if you're going to mitigate harassment, are you limiting the ability to engage in protest? And that's like the framework I tend to work in specifically. So for example, if a way to like mitigate harassment is to make sure that there are like unknown actors or people that are pretending to be other people, you can ask for a lot more personal data. But what does that do to protesters inside the United States or outside the United States? Or, for example, with Wikipedia right now, we're currently blocked in Turkey. What happens when you ask people for certain data? What does it mean to be anonymous? What happens when you have to be anonymous because the different kinds of information you're accessing or creating or the content you're creating can put you in harm's way? So as a designer, I often think about those frameworks, which is, if I were to design a system safe for the United States, it would be radically unsafe for the rest of the world. And I feel ethically as a designer, I cannot do that. So how do you have enough stories or personas or ideas of what safety is? How do you think about safety that doesn't just affect you but to others? The police are not a safety mechanism for most people in the United States, and you have to think about that. What is the baseline of like the system you're building? And so for me, it's a series of questions of, if I do X, what happens? What's the worst thing that could happen? What's the medium to worst thing that could happen? What is like a low level bad thing? And then to actually like outline that and work through all of those different scenarios. I like to think of it, it's not a bug, it's a feature until you fix it. So how do you really think about, if this is intending to hold this data, how can it be misused? If you're asking, if Facebook makes you use your real name, how does that affect you in other parts of the world? How does it affect you here? How does it make you feel, even if it's not a surveillance system, but that you can't prove what you want your name to be? How does that affect trans people? We have time for like one more.
Thank you. This has been great. Is my microphone on? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. So there was a really interesting paper that came out a couple years ago by James Summers, maybe, talking about the ways in which programming languages shape organizational psychology. And it seemed, I think Kate sort of put her finger on it earlier when it was sort of talking about the sort of scale and the scope of interventions, not just being technical and maybe not just being social, being part of this larger kind of interwoven socio-technical intervention. And I'm wondering, in what ways are not only the tools that organizations and sort of corporations are using to not only collect data, but also to sort of build these technical systems, not inbuilt with the kind of ethical mechanisms, but also how is that shaping the ways in which, and is shaped by the organization themselves, who maybe themselves don't even have that kind of ethical mechanism. So I'm wondering if you could speak more about that, if that's something you notice as well.
I feel like that's a whole other panel discussion.
Yeah, that is.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
But what I like is that, and I think what this panel has been really fantastic for, and thank you to everyone for being part of it, is just that sense of, we're really talking about how these design decisions, how we even begin to imagine what data is. What data is collected is an imaginative choice. Like, data is not a thing that exists in the world until we call it as such. So we are invoking things into being by the way that we are constructing this space. And technologists right now are the people who have an enormous amount of power to decide what constitutes data and how that data reflects what they understand human society to look like. And unfortunately, because the people who predominantly are engineers in these spaces tend to be white men who come from a very similar education background, they have a very particular lens on this. That means that there are whole ways of being in the world that aren't being told in those systems. So, I would just take your question as a provocation to say, how do we start thinking about those other ways of being? How do we start to think about, utopias that we might like to live in, and how do we get there?
Yeah, and I'll just add to others, there's a really good essay that was written around this topic, specifically through Kate's lens about it, by Jacob Harris, called "Consider the Boolean," which I really recommend you read if you're interested in like how small choices in building these data structures can go on to guide the types of effects they can and can't have.
Yeah. I think we actually have time for one more question. Sarah, right there.
Thanks, Caroline. Sarah Watson. I want to propose this to the panel. It's been mulling around in my head as one of the maybe solutions for changing the tenor of the conversation towards discussing things that are about optimization, right? All of this discussion about ethics is really about, how we're designing the systems, to what ends. And I think a lot of the times regular consumers just aren't privy to like the way that the engineers are thinking about these questions. And I feel like one of those ways of reframing both what we believe as users, as consumers, is part of the way the system is designed, which is to say, can we talk about optimization? Do we agree to the terms of optimization? Even in the case of Facebook, we're looking at something that, you know, is basically just designed to keep you spending more time on Facebook. And those are the terms that the engineers are working towards, and that's the terms that Facebook is working towards for creating shareholder value through advertising, right? But that's not necessarily how people actually want to be using Facebook. So, you know, can we start to get some vocabulary and dialogue about like what those terms of optimization are? That's maybe a potential way to cut into this conversation.
I doubt it. I think we need to be listening more, as opposed to like telling people, like trying to explain a lot of this stuff. And also, I think that we as technologists have a tendency of thinking that the systems that we're building and we're making, we have control over, and that we have some semblance of understanding of the implications of our systems. And like my whole premise is that we don't. I don't know what the implications of my own systems, even the ones I work on today. I don't know what the implication, like who will use this code in the future, or how it can be misused or whatever. That's why I like to have like temperature checks and discussions about that potentiality. I also think that consumers know that the consumers and the users, that they have more of an understanding than we give them, and that they have more to contribute to the conversation than we can contribute to their conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I would say actually in some cases systems are designed in order to not show people what a system is optimizing for, and to make you think that, oh, I'm playing a game where I collect Pokemon. No, actually, you're feeding a giant system that's going to be used to create a massive parallel mapping system. I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, we are all functioning within systems that more frequently than not are a bait and switch that make you think that you're, doing something to, create a beautiful picture of your face that you can, change in different ways, but actually they're using it to collect facial recognition data. So again, I mean, I think this idea that that we can know what systems are optimizing for when these are held completely away from consumers, I think is a real issue we have to talk about.
For consumers, but also, I mean, I think thinking about branding again, but like branding towards the employees, like, Facebook doesn't think. Nobody sits there thinking like we're gonna like be evil, right? Like because they're branded internally that they're. One of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life. We got sent a Facebook branding book, and on the second and third page was a gatefold, and it was the Berlin Wall coming down, and a picture of Tiananmen Square with Tank Man, and then on the next page it said we're changing the world. Like they have the audacity to put themselves in the same sentence as that man. They really do. They believe it. And that's like, until we change that, then we have a real problem. Like as long as people think that they're like literally doing God's work by keeping us busy on the internet, then we're not going to do anything. Like that's not going to change.
So to that point, I mean, I think we have a lot of really talented people in this room. For example, I mean, one thing I try to do as a designer is like I have this little column at Fastco, and the reason why I have this column is because I know that that's where like Facebook designers go to read. And so I'm trying to have like a series of longer term ethical conversations around AI and design. But I think at some point, and I'm not suggesting we all do this, but some of us could, like how do you reach these people? You have to evangelize it in a way. How do you have conversations? Maybe it's going to like developer conferences and design conferences and actually talking about these things. I did a design workshop at Facebook, and part of what I did was just design thinking around how do you like label different kinds of events that could be harassment, and then I had the designers go through and label what are all the ones that you've done from an American perspective. What are all the different kinds of things that would get taken down? And this is like, I'm one human. This is one human against a machine, but how do you also think about like, having a bigger conversation with those people. Like Sarah, you have the ability to write an article directly tailored to that audience, for example. If you have an idea of design parameters, code parameters, you can, like, a lot of us in this room work in tech, because I know a bunch of the people in this room. I see you. Like, I'll find you later. Like, it's worth having those conversations. It's a small drop in the bucket. I don't think that this is a sustainable way to like change everything, but I do think it's important to understand that like some of the people that like work in these companies they're being sort of fed Kool-Aid in a way. This is a very unelegant way to say this, right? But like when you look at like what it's like to go and work inside these places and what Jer has mentioned, like people buy into that idea, and it's really easy to lose sight of like, actually this thing that I'm making is not going to make the world better, because I have to like pull myself out of the system I'm in and really look at it and say like, what would a world be like with less Facebook? And that's not what happens when you work there. And I think that we can try to reach the employees of those companies.
But honestly, like, how would you know? I mean, this is a really hard question. How would you know the social impact of a system that you're designing right now? We don't have the science, the tools, the methodologies, the frameworks to do that. And for me, this is why this is actually a real question at stake. You could say to somebody, hey, just to understand the long term, we don't know how to do it yet. We actually have to create that as a serious form of investigation, as serious as trying to design the next kick-ass ML system.
Totally. I mean, I think it's why like anti-design pattern or anti-dark patterns, for example, like dark patterns are these design decisions where they obfuscate and they nudge you towards other things, and that's like totally the privacy design of Facebook, for example. They're constantly switching up like the privacy UI, so it's really hard for a regular person to understand how public they are. And a great example is if you ever do a Facebook Live video and you click on the UI to make it public to everyone, it overrides all of your privacy settings, so everything you've posted is public. I'm not joking.
And also, if you like accidentally log into a service that you link to Facebook, it reactivates your whole Facebook account. It happened. I was on Facebook for 8 years, and then or 7 years, and then it like reactivated because I like started an app up or something. Anyways.
As a sort of a last point for my perspective, I really think we need to ask ourselves, like, especially because, you know, like you're saying, for the next 20 years, like, we don't know what's going to happen. But at what point do we, like, I look at the world and I see an algorithmically driven world, but I also see, like, how when we started off this conversation, you were talking about an article that was algorithmically driven, about writing articles about how algorithmically driven things were happening. At what point are we not in a human-driven world, but an algorithmically driven world? At what point do the algorithms have more control over us than we have over them? And I think that's a bigger, deeper question. And it's also one that when we're looking at data and privacy today, we need to look at the possibility of at what point does this data become not human control anymore? That's it.
On that note.
So thank you everyone for coming. For the next 30 minutes or so, as we start to break down, there is wine and snacks in the other room. I'd like to give a big hand to all of our participants today. I mean, this has been really exciting for me. One of the reasons that my friends and I started Facets was, how do you sort of take conversations amongst multidisciplinary practitioners and have them in a participatory way with the audience? And it's something that I think today has sort of really highlighted, where we've been in conversation where people have felt empowered to, like, not just ask questions, like, but to leave comments. And I think that that's really, really important. I was going to make an off-color joke, which I'll still make, but I also want to give a hand to all of our male panel participants. Thank you for adding diversity. There's one per each panel. But this has been really amazing. Every panel today has had a majority women, non-gender binary participants, and this is a conference on artificial intelligence. But please, please feel free to stay while we clean up and continue to ask questions, and let's keep the conversation going.